Let us attempt to distinguish two determinations of the import of the term transcendental. So, the first one will be the one that has to do with German idealism. So Kant, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, and anyone else for whom is applicable, as they stand in contradistinction to the considerations that came not arbitrarily, but through realizing difficulties raised by people like Jacobi and Schelling, and then later on by many people, Dilthey, Husserl, and so forth, Nietzsche, and many thinkers. So we're not talking really about let's set the scene for a second. We're talking about 8 of the 10 best universities in the world were in the German-speaking world in the 19th century, the other two being Oxbridge. The American universities at the time were still in a phase of being institutions which had been created for the sake of creating pastors, which, however, had gone way beyond that, but nonetheless were not the dominant institutions they are today. The London School of Economics didn't exist. Those were so these Prussian universities were the center of intelligence. So we had many people working on these problems, and they weren't the result of, as it were, just isolated insights of a few people, but it was a large-scale propounding of ideas which were then being criticized, which were then new problems were being raised. So I say this in order to show that once we get to the second notion of the transcendental, it's not arbitrary. It's that a lot of checking's been done very thoroughly and at a high level, extremely subtle and careful work has been done. So the first version, which people are more familiar with, is roughly that the problem out of Hume, because Hume has challenged this question of how we get our concepts, especially in the notion of causality, and Kant has taken this up, and Hume has given a kind of rough sort of early phenomenological view, just observe what's happening rather than starting as much as possible, rather than taking for granted that the received tradition is the correct way to go, the received concepts are the correct concepts to work with, which is often almost impossible to dispense with because they seep into our ordinary everyday usage. So Hume's famous for this concept, this remark that he has challenged in philosophy, the concept of causality, but then when he goes out onto the streets of London, he acts as though in his daily life there is he relies on that concept anyway. So we rely on these concepts so much that it's difficult that we would go to a point of completely rooting them out, going to the roots of them and checking them to see in this manner called destruction later on in Kant and Heidegger, and then later on deconstruction in Derrida, basically of checking to see if all of our daily notions are superstitions, because any of them could possibly, the things that we use and go by daily could possibly be nothing different than the most primitive superstition. Just because we rely on them, and other people, everybody relies on them, gives them a special, it gives us a special feeling that they're the real thing, because it's a kind of social power, right? And also they may be very efficacious, but simply still ultimately false. So from out of this horizon, we get the original question of what are the conditions of any possible experience. And this is basically said in something that would be later called a pure psychology. By Kant. So famously, of course, space and time are supposed to be the things that are necessarily for just that we could have intelligibility at all. So if you basically, what they're doing is they're abstracting from any question of anatomy. So the first step is, like, you ask, there's a creature, so like a human being or a spider, and then you can see the world's going to look totally different to a spider than it does to a human being. They had different sensoriums. Just as one can remember, maybe if one has memories from when one was very young, the world looked larger, right? Because we were smaller. So the sensorium and there's a relativity there. The world is relative to our sensorium, and but if you abstract from any question of looking at anatomy or looking at the structure of the eye or something like that, like in terms of you have eyes that are the so-called tetrachromites. Some human beings have more color sensitivity than others, and so on. But instead you just say there's this question of intelligibility at all, of being able to understand things at all, and that this we look at independent of the question of how it's substantiated in a body. And then we pose this question of basically, what do you need to have to sort of understand anything at all? And Kant asked this question. So that's kind of the horizon of more or less the horizon of the first wave. Of course, if we study Kant properly, then we need, many years of, because Kant, it's not like you can just read the Critique of Pure Reason or something. You also have to know what were the textbooks that Kant was working with, just as you want to know, as it were, what kind of musical instruments did people or composers writing music for in the 14th century. If you want to know about 14th century music, you'd want to know how did what textbooks was Kant working with, what textbooks were students working with, who was he talking to, how did he understand what a philosopher was, what was this new Aufklärung movement of reason that said a philosopher must be doing something helpful for human beings, what were their presupposition, what was the really questions they're asking, so on. But just so you can see, I'm just giving the most bare précis, the most bare orientation to look at the problem. But there's two waves. That's the first one, and then later on, after all is said and done, let's see, what we're talking about, like 1800 for Kant, 1824. I don't know when he died. 1804, I think. Hegel dies like 1834. So this kind of French Revolution, Napoleonic era as far as politics and history goes. History without qualification usually means the history of wars, so Napoleon's wars. Um, and then we get, as it were, another going over the same problems once we see that this kind of once basically I think Hegel is the last gasp. You see Hegel tries to produce a system which doesn't really work and doesn't convince anyone, and then what Hegel does is he produces legislation. He produces recommendations for legislators, which are very good, but their ultimate metaphysical basis is not at all persuasive to anyone who thinks it through completely. And then the next wave is based on this move. You say, instead of just a pure psychology where you abstract from the anatomy of a specific sensorium and just look at the questions in terms of they call it pure psychology later on. So it's not only intelligibility in terms of cognition, which links to Descartes, where cognition means I ask, what is this thing? And I can give an answer in terms of what it is. But you could also add the categories that Carl Jung has later on. Carl Jung is born in, I think, 1870, something around there. So we're talking about much later, after many things have happened. And those universities I was just mentioned. You get this notion of 4 different functions, like 4 different basic pure psychological functions. Feeling, which means like if you accept or reject something. Sensation, which is just somehow experience as knowing something's happening at all. Thinking as asking, what is this thing, which is the main one, which is kind of seems to play a bigger role in philosophy on the whole. Like, what kind of thing is this? Is it a car? Is it the sky? Is it a matter of politics? Is it a matter of justice, etc., etc.? And then in Jung, you have the intuition, which is another of these pure psychological forms, which is about sort of somehow sensing what's going to happen in the future. But these can be kind of rolled together in the cognito and Descartes as a sort of naive pure psychology. But once you pose the question of is this pure psychology relative to a specific world, so that it's as though we're also at the same time posing the notion that there's a world that has some specific characteristics. So Kant comes to the notion that the world must always have some kind of spatial characteristics, right? Then you realize that there's a problem of presupposing what the real world is about. So the real world must be the world independent of us, of the pure psychology, then takes on all kinds of characteristics, such as spatial, such as originally in Descartes, it turns out, sort of retrospectively, we see that Descartes had been the first one to really do this. Of course, Descartes was working with what was already insisted on by Galileo and sort of these preoccupations of Copernicus and Hobbes and etc., etc. There's a good debate. The exchange between Hobbes and Descartes in the over Descartes' Meditations is good here. It's very short and it's sharp. You can see where Hobbes really uses this simply in order to insist on his view that the real world, independent of the pure psychology, must be something which can be dealt with quantity and with mathematics. And then so for instance, in the example which is still used, that the color spectrum can be quantified. And then you end up getting all these confused. In the current analytic philosophy, you always have sort of a backslide where it's forgotten everything that was learned from, let's say, the year 1800 to the year 1900. Everything is sort of forgotten or not taken seriously somehow, because those universities no longer exist, because Prussia has been obliterated from the memory of human civilization somehow. So they're always trying to relitigate things which were already known to Husserl, to Heidegger, to Leo Strauss, etc., in a very kind of naive way. So so they always raise this question of things like that stupid example of a researcher who had never seen the color green, but only knew about the sort of green as a matter of a conceptual idea about the spectrum, and therefore could deal with it consistently, but hadn't actually got the, how do they call it, the so-called qualia of green and so forth. All these things are distractions from the real problem. So I'll mention here what Leo Strauss said. Leo Strauss said, if you go to all the chief problems and then you go to the people that are bad, like which would include pretty much all contemporary dominant Anglo-Saxon philosophy, which means the analytic philosophy, and to a large extent it also includes continental philosophy, because they're also pretty bad, even though they deal with good sources, but they don't understand them. And then if you would go through all that, Leo Strauss says, who was actually from those universities and understood what, as a personal student of Husserl and Heidegger, he says you would eventually work through all the people that were of a lower standard, who hadn't thought through the things thoroughly enough and with enough profundity. And if you took all these problems very profoundly, then you would get to Heidegger. So the next step is to see that it's unintelligible to try to give a specific account of what the real world is as over and against this pure psychology, because you're always giving it some you're making it relative to whatever you're dealing with. Any set of so-called conditions of any possible experience are relative to some presupposed world. And then this is kind of the point where Husserl comes in and sees that there must be we need to set ourselves again on a direct phenomenology, and then you get everything that leads up to Heidegger's posing of this new question of the what I get from Thomas Sheenan is identifying Arignus with the same things that Heidegger's doing already in Being in Time, when he is excluding the subject. So the excluding of the Kantian subject, which had replaced the soul, but not simply and straightforwardly, but also somehow in the awareness of Descartes having replaced the soul with the cognito, or with the Bewusstsein, or this idea of the I having something that it could doubt in general, which it could then say, even though I'm doubting it, I know that I, the one who is doubting, is real. So you get this setup of a position between the pure psychology and the world. It's in Husserl that we start to go beyond this problem, which had been already for like Descartes born in 1650. So we have a lot of thorough thinking about it, and then finally you start to go past that, and then this is because Heidegger, whatever you say, he's dedicated this book being in time to Husserl, and he's giving a lot of lip service to Husserl in that book. So he mentions Husserl's understanding of the transcendental there, and that's very confusing, I think. But he's actually going past it to this position where there's no longer primarily we're starting with Kantian subject, or this juxtaposition of subject and world, but a new position is arrived at.